April the 6th, 1944, near the Czech border. Flight Lieutenant Bertram Jimmy. James tasted blood where the Gestapo officer's fist had split his lip. The freedom he'd fought for through 300 feet of dark tunnel had lasted 13 days. Now, chained wrist to ankle in the back of a Wehrmacht truck, he understood with clarity that this was different. The Luftwaffe guards at Stalag Luft III had been military men, professionals who'd treated RAF prisoners with grudging respect. The two SS men in the cab ahead spoke in clipped business-like German about quotas and processing. James wasn't a prisoner of war anymore. He was inventory. One of 76 escapees who had made the Third Reich look like fools. As the truck ground northward toward Berlin, the countryside rolled past through a gap in the canvas. Spring 1944. Germany was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and the SS had long memories for humiliation. The local policeman who'd checked his forged papers in a small Czech village had known immediately. Something about the way James carried himself, the too new stitching on his civilian jacket, the practiced ease of his cover story. Within an hour, the Gestapo had arrived. They'd beaten him methodically in the village jail's basement, not for information, but as punctuation. Each blow said, "You made us look weak, now you'll pay." They cared nothing for the Geneva Convention. James was no longer Flying Officer James of the RAF. He was Prisoner X, recaptured great escaper, a political embarrassment requiring administrative solution. The truck journey took 4 days. James learned to sleep sitting up, chains cutting into his wrists. They fed him once daily, thin soup and black bread. The guards never spoke to him directly. At night, locked in a local jail cell, he could hear other prisoners. The walls were thin enough to hear weeping, prayers in Polish, German, other languages he didn't recognize, and the occasional scream that stopped abruptly. Whatever the SS intended for him, it had nothing to do with Luftwaffe POW camps and Red Cross inspections. On the morning of April the 10th, 1944, the truck arrived at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, 30 kilometers north of Berlin. James saw the entrance first, a heavy gate beneath a tower, the cynical motto, Arbeit Macht Frei, wrought in iron letters. Work sets you free. He'd heard whispers about these camps during Stalag Luft III's secret intelligence briefings, places where political prisoners vanished, where the rules of war dissolved into something older and more savage. The truck passed through 2 checkpoints. SS guards in their death's head insignia watched with bored efficiency. This wasn't a military installation. It was a machine. The guards unloaded James in a courtyard designated for special prisoners. He counted 6 other men there, all in various stages of degradation. 3 wore remnants of military uniforms. 2 looked like civilians. 1 man bore the unmistakable stamp of the camps already, skeletal and moving with mechanical slowness. An SS Hauptscharführer approached with a clipboard, smoking casually. He looked at James like one might inspect a damaged package. "RAF," he said in accented English. "Great escape." Not a question. The Gestapo had telegraphed ahead. The SS knew who he was and why he'd come. The Hauptscharführer gestured to 2 guards. They dragged James toward a low concrete building. The processing room smelled of phenol and old fear. They stripped him naked, catalogued his scars, shaved his head with clippers that pulled as much as cut. The camp doctor, a disinterested Austrian, examined him for communicable diseases with the detachment of a veterinarian. They issued him the striped uniform of a concentration camp prisoner, rough chafing fabric. On the left breast, they stitched a red triangle for political prisoner. Below it, a number. He was no longer James. He was prisoner 59432. The transformation took less than 30 minutes. When they marched him to Block 18 in the Sonderlager, the special prisoners section, he caught his reflection in a window. A gaunt stranger with hollow eyes stared back. Sachsenhausen was different from any military prison James had known. The camp sprawled across acres, divided into zones by electrified fences. Guard towers studded the perimeter every 100 meters, searchlights ready to blaze at night. The main camp held thousands of prisoners, but the Sonderlager was isolated, a camp within a camp for those the Reich considered particularly dangerous. Block 18 housed recaptured escapers, enemy commandos, political prisoners deemed too valuable to kill immediately. The SS wanted them available for leverage, interrogation, or simply prolonged suffering as examples. Inside the block, 60 men existed in a space designed for 30. Triple-decker bunks lined both walls, each platform shared by 3 men. The air reeked of unwashed bodies and the latrine buckets that weren't emptied often enough. A Dutch resistance fighter named Van der Berg, imprisoned here since 1943, explained the rules in whispered English. Morning roll call at 0500 regardless of weather. Work details in the camp's industrial zone from 0600 to 1800. Evening roll call at 1900, sometimes lasting hours if the count didn't match. Rations twice daily. Ersatz coffee tasting like burnt acorns. Thin soup with occasional potato scraps, 200 grams of sawdust-contaminated bread. The SS don't shoot us here, Van der Berg said. They just work us to death slowly. But James noticed something else. Despite the brutality, despite the starvation and exhaustion, the men in Block 18 hadn't surrendered. A British commando named Thornton had fashioned a crude calendar from smuggled pencil stubs, marking each day behind his bunk. A Free French officer named Leclerc had organized a secret language school, prisoners teaching each other phrases in whispered sessions after lights out. The human spirit, compressed under impossible pressure, was crystallizing into something harder than the SS anticipated. These men were survivors, and survivors adapted. On his 3rd night, James learned about Sachsenhausen's unique horror. The camp wasn't just a prison. It was a testing ground. During evening roll call, he watched SS engineers measure the parade ground, timing prisoners marching set distances in different boots. Sachsenhausen had a special track where prisoners were forced to march up to 40 kilometers daily, testing military boot soles for the Wehrmacht. The camp counterfeiting Operation Bernhard, printed fake British pounds in Block 18's neighbouring barracks using skilled prisoners forced to forge currency. The SS wasn't simply punishing enemies here, they were extracting value from the condemned. James understood then what made Sachsenhausen uniquely dangerous. At Stalag Luft III, he'd been a prisoner of war with rights under international law. Here, he was human raw material. The camp's proximity to Berlin meant high-ranking SS officials visited frequently, inspecting operations, demanding efficiency. The guards rotated from other camps, bringing methods perfected elsewhere. Sachsenhausen was where the SS refined their systems of control before exporting them across occupied Europe. On April 15, 1944, 1 month after the Great Escape, the camp commandant summoned all recaptured escapers to his office. James stood with 11 other men who'd been caught after the Stalag Luft III breakout. The commandant, an SS Sturmbannführer named Schulze, addressed them with cold formality. 50 of your fellow escapers have been shot while resisting recapture, he announced in perfect English. You 12 are alive because the Führer may yet find use for you. The lie was transparent. Everyone knew the truth. Hitler had ordered 50 executed as reprisal, selected arbitrarily from the recaptured. James and the other survivors had simply drawn lucky lots in the SS lottery. The message was clear. You live on borrowed time. Behave accordingly. But as James marched back to Block 18, passing the camp's industrial zone, he saw something that ignited a dangerous spark. In the Schuhprüfstrecke, the boot testing track, prisoners were marching in wooden clogs designed to simulate various military footwear. The SS engineers measured distances with surveying equipment. They timed every lap. And they were meticulous about documentation, keeping logs, creating schedules. The SS passion for record-keeping was legendary. In that obsession, James recognized possibility. If the SS needed to document everything, they needed materials, paper, ink, filing systems. And wherever there were systems, there were vulnerabilities. At Stalag Luft III, he'd helped dig a tunnel with smuggled tools and forged papers. Here, in this concentration camp, under the nose of the SS, surrounded by electrified wire and watchtowers, in a camp designed to break men's spirits through methodical degradation, Jimmy James began to wonder, what could a desperate man build when the guards believed resistance was impossible? That night, as searchlights swept the camp perimeter and guard dogs howled, James made his first illegal contact. A Polish engineer named Kowalski, imprisoned for sabotage, worked in the camp's administrative offices repairing typewriters. He had access to supplies. More importantly, he had information about guard schedules, which SS officers were corruptible, and the camp's hidden economy of cigarettes and stolen goods. "You're thinking about escape," Kowalski whispered in the dark. "I can see it. Every new prisoner thinks about it." James said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Kowalski's voice dropped lower. The last man who tried was hung on the fence for 3 days as a warning. Then, after a long pause, "But there might be another way. Not out, not yet, but something they'd never expect." The searchlight swept across their block window, painting shadows across the bunks. Somewhere in the distance, a guard shouted commands. The machine ground on, mechanical and relentless. But Jimmy James, survivor of the Great Escape, who'd crawled 300 feet through a tunnel only to land in the Reich's testing ground of horrors, felt his mind engaging with a problem the SS would never anticipate. In a camp designed to reduce men to numbers, he was about to build something that would make the Gestapo question their own eyes. Chapter 2. The Sonderlager at Sachsenhausen operated on a different frequency than Stalag Luft III. Within 24 hours of arrival, James understood this distinction viscerally. The first morning roll call began at 0430 hours in the pre-dawn darkness of the parade ground. SS Scharführer Icarius strode down the line of exhausted airmen, his polished boots reflecting the floodlights, stopping without warning to strike prisoners across the face with his leather gloves. His eyes were flat and bored, the violence a simple administrative function. The roll call stretched past 3 hours. Men swayed on their feet, some collapsing only to be kicked upright by guards. James locked his knees and fixed his eyes on the watchtower directly ahead, counting the seconds between searchlight rotations. 16 seconds. The detail embedded itself in his consciousness without intention. The work assignment came at 0800 hours. James and 15 other RAF officers were marched to a brick factory on the camp's eastern perimeter. The work was deliberately pointless, moving bricks from one pile to another, then back again the following day. The guards made this clear through savage humor, laughing as prisoners strained under loads that served no purpose beyond degradation. The spring sun climbed higher, and James felt his body begin to fail in ways it never had at Sagan. His hands, still healing from the tunnel's collapse during the Great Escape, split open against the rough brick edges. Blood made the surfaces slippery. By midday, his vision tunneled. The man beside him, Squadron Leader Wally Floody, the Canadian mining engineer who had designed the tunnels at Stalag Luft III, stumbled and dropped his load. An SS guard's rifle butt caught him in the kidneys. Floody went down hard. James kept moving his bricks, eyes forward, survival instinct overriding every impulse to help. Compassion was a liability, an invitation for a rifle butt of his own. Their training, their brotherhood, was a language not spoken here. The guards were watching for exactly that reaction. The noon meal arrived in metal containers carried by capos, political prisoners who had survived long enough to earn positions of marginal authority. Watery turnip soup, 1 ladle per man, served in rusted bowls that had to be returned immediately. James drank his portion in 4 swallows, the lukewarm liquid barely coating his throat. his stomach cramped with the shock of something, anything, entering it. The bread ration came at evening roll call, 200 grams of sawdust-laced black bread, hard as wood. He forced himself to eat it slowly, making each small piece last, a technique the veteran prisoners had whispered during the march to the factory. Make it last. Your mind needs to believe you're eating more than you are. That first night in the Sonderlager barracks, James lay on wooden boards that served as a bunk and catalogued the damage. His body weight, already reduced from the tunnel work at Sagan, had dropped further. He could feel each rib distinctly. The cramping in his legs suggested the onset of edema. Around him, men coughed through the darkness, the sound wet and infectious. The thin walls did nothing to muffle the despair, creating a constant, low thrum of human misery. Someone 3 bunks over sobbed quietly. James closed his eyes and found himself automatically calculating distances he had observed during the day's work detail. The factory to the perimeter fence, 140 meters. The fence to the nearest tree line beyond the camp, perhaps 200 meters more. He stopped himself. Escape wasn't the priority. Survival was. The second week introduced James to the camp's true hierarchy of suffering. The Sonderlager held the recaptured Great Escape officers, but beyond its barbed wire perimeter stretched to the main concentration camp where 30,000 political prisoners, Soviet POWs, and Jews existed in states of systematic annihilation. The RAF men received marginally better rations, their status as officer prisoners technically protected by Geneva Conventions that the SS ignored when convenient but acknowledged when it served propaganda purposes. It was a strange, precarious privilege that felt more like a different category of condemnation than a genuine protection. The political prisoners in the adjacent compounds received far less. James watched them during work details, skeletal figures in striped uniforms moving like automated mechanisms, their eyes empty of everything but the immediate task. They didn't look at the RAF officers. To acknowledge difference was to acknowledge what they themselves had become. By the third week, patterns emerged. The guards changed shifts at 1600, 1400 and 2200 hours. During the 15-minute transition, supervision loosened fractionally. The capo who delivered the soup, a Polish political prisoner named Kowalski, sometimes tilted the ladle deeper into the container where chunks of turnip settled. He never spoke, never made eye contact, but James noticed he performed this small mercy only for prisoners who stood straight during roll call, who maintained some fragment of military bearing. It was a test and a gift simultaneously. Kowalski was selecting who might survive. The work details rotated. Some days the brick factory, other days digging drainage ditches that flooded with the next rain, making the previous day's labor worthless. On his fourth week, James was assigned to a carpentry workshop inside the main camp. Here, prisoners built wooden cases for artillery shells under the supervision of an elderly SS guard named Hirsch, who had lost 3 fingers on the Eastern Front. Hirsch was methodical rather than sadistic, more interested in production quotas than punishment. He allowed prisoners to sit while working, a luxury that meant survival for men whose legs had swollen with malnutrition. James found himself beside Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowse, a pilot who had been recaptured near the Czech border. Dowse had trained as a furniture maker before the war. His hands, despite starvation, still moved with precision across the wood. "Notice the lumber storage?" Dowse murmured one afternoon, his voice barely audible beneath the sound of sawing. "They don't inventory it, just count finished cases." His eyes didn't leave his work. James understood immediately. Lumber could be taken, small pieces at a time if one was careful, but taken for what purpose? To build what? The question planted itself. The first death among the RAF prisoners came in the 5th week. Pilot Officer Williams, who had been sick since recapture, developed pneumonia. The camp hospital, if the disease-filled barracks could be called that, offered no treatment. Williams died on a wooden pallet. his last words asking someone to tell his mother he'd tried. The Germans recorded his death as natural causes and had his body cremated in the camp's facility before nightfall. James and 5 others were selected to carry the corpse. The crematorium building was concrete and efficient, its chimney a constant presence against the sky. James had smelled it since arrival without consciously acknowledging what he was smelling. The air near the building was thick and greasy, a smell of burnt fat and scorched machinery. Carrying Williams inside, seeing the industrial nature of death at Sachsenhausen, shattered something and rebuilt it harder. Williams had given up. James would not. By the 2nd month, James's body had adapted to starvation in ways he hadn't known possible. His metabolism slowed, his mind sharpened paradoxically, becoming hyper-aware of details while losing capacity for complex planning. He noticed everything, which guards were predictable, which were randomly violent, where the fence posts had rotted slightly, how the gravel on the parade ground could muffle footsteps if you walked at the edges. These observations collected without purpose, his subconscious filing information against some future need. Wing Commander Harry Day arrived in the Sonderlager during James's 7th week. Day was the senior British officer among the Great Escape prisoners, a veteran of escape attempts dating back to World War I. His name was a legend in the POW camps, a symbol of indefatigable opposition to his captors. The Germans kept him in isolation for the first 2 weeks, trying to break his authority over the other prisoners. When he finally entered the general population, he moved through the barracks like a man inspecting troops, noting who had survived and who was failing. He stopped at James's bunk. "You're holding together, Flight Lieutenant." It wasn't a question. James nodded once. Day's eyes were evaluating, calculating. "Good. We'll need men who can still think when the opportunity comes." The statement hung in the air like a fuse lit in darkness. Opportunity. The word was seditious in this place, dangerous even to contemplate, but James felt something shift in his chest, a rekindling of purpose beyond the next meal, the next roll call. He began watching Day during the work details, noting how the senior officer subtly organized the prisoners, establishing a chain of communication through glances and brief gestures, rebuilding military structure in Hell's architecture. The carpentry workshop became James's regular assignment. Dowes continued his quiet commentary, teaching James to see the building not as a prison workshop, but as a resource. The wood planes have steel blades that could be sharpened. The varnish is alcohol-based, flammable. The finished cases are stored in the shed for 2 days before transport. Each observation was neutral, factual, but accumulating towards something unspoken. James found himself studying the workshop's layout during lunch breaks, the distance from workbench to exit, the single guard position, the schedule of German inspections. One morning in late June, a transport of new prisoners arrived at the main camp. James watched from the factory as the cattle cars were unloaded, the mass of humanity spilling onto the parade ground. Among them, he noticed Soviet prisoners in Red Army uniforms, soldiers captured on the Eastern Front. They were marched to a separate compound, and James heard rumors from the capos. The Soviets were being interrogated, some selected for training programs, others for execution. The details were vague, dangerous to discuss, but one fact emerged clearly. The Germans were using some Soviet prisoners as forced labor in specialized workshops. They were building something in a secured area on the camp's north side. The observation crystallized one afternoon when a work detail of Soviet prisoners passed to the carpentry workshop. They were carrying lumber, not rough wood like the workshop received, but finished planks, precisely milled. Their guard was Luftwaffe, not SS, and he was armed but appeared to be supervising technical work rather than punishment labor. James's mind, sharpened by months of survival, made the connection instantly. The separate pieces of information he had been subconsciously collecting, Dows's lumber, Day's promise of opportunity, the Luftwaffe's presence, slammed together into a coherent, terrifying whole. Specialized work, Luftwaffe supervision, finished lumber. They were building something that flew. That evening, back in the barracks, James lay on his wooden boards and felt the mental shift complete itself. For 2 months, he had survived by thinking only of the present. The next roll call, the next meal, not being noticed. But Day's words had opened a door in his consciousness, and the sight of those Soviet prisoners carrying aircraft-quality lumber had revealed what lay beyond it. Sachsenhausen, for all its horrors, was not hermetically sealed. Specialized work details moved between compounds. Luftwaffe guards could be manipulated differently than SS, and somewhere in this camp, prisoners were building aircraft components. The possibility was insane, suicidal even to contemplate. But James had already survived the impossible once, had crawled through 110 meters of tunnel in Stalag Luft III, only to be recaptured and sent to this manufactured hell. The Germans had put him here to die or to be forgotten. Instead, they had placed him adjacent to the means of escape they couldn't imagine he would recognize. His background as a flight officer, his time in the carpentry workshop, his observation of the Soviet work details, pieces of a plan were assembling themselves from the raw material of camp routine. James didn't sleep that night. He lay in the darkness, listening to the coughs and whispers of dying men, and felt purpose solidify in his chest like a stone. Surviving wasn't enough anymore. Getting out was the only thing that mattered. And somewhere in the methodical nightmare of Sachsenhausen, between the carpentry workshop and the Soviet compound, between the patterns of guard rotations and the inventory gaps in lumber storage, there was a way. He just had to see it clearly enough to build it. For the first time in months, James felt the hunter's instinct stir within him, not the praise. Chapter 3, June 1944, Sachsenhausen's Sonderlager. A smuggled newspaper delivered the soul-crushing blow. Flight Lieutenant Bertram James read the list of names and knew his defiance had come at an unbearable cost. 50 of his fellow great escapers, including his close friend Roger Bushell, had been executed by the Gestapo on Hitler's personal order. The news ripped through the small contingent of recaptured airmen, transforming grief into a cold rage. For James it was a breaking point. While others sank into despair, he felt an electrifying clarity. They could not let the murderers have the last word. To merely survive in this place was not enough. It was an insult to the memory of the 50. That very evening, in the dim light of the barrack, James, along with 4 other British officers, made a solemn vow. They would not wait for liberation. They would escape from this concentration camp, or they would die trying. The plan had to be impossible, audacious and immediate. James felt his hands shake as he reread Roger Bushell's name, Big X, the mastermind, shot in the back of the head on a roadside. The Gestapo had called it an escape attempt. The lie was obscene. Hitler had ordered 50 murders to terrify the rest into submission. James looked around the Sonderlager barracks at the other recaptured officers, Squadron Leader Jack Churchill, Major Johnny Dodge, Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowes, Captain Peter Churchill. Each face reflected the same transformation happening inside him. The executions had crossed an uncrossable line. They were no longer prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protections. They were concentration camp inmates, marked for eventual liquidation. The only question was when. That realization burned through the fog of captivity like acid. Every moment of passive acceptance suddenly felt like a betrayal of the 50. Every day spent waiting for liberation was another day the murders went unanswered. The rage crystallized into something harder, clearer, and more dangerous than despair. James stood and walked to the window, studying the camp with eyes that had stopped seeing imprisonment and started seeing geometry. Sachsenhausen was no Stalag Luft III. The Sonderlager special compound sat within the larger concentration camp complex, surrounded by layers of security that made their previous escape from the tunnel look almost simple. Two parallel 3-meter-high wire fences formed a perfect perimeter. Between them ran a no-man's land patrolled by guards with dogs. Watchtowers punctuated every 50 meters, searchlights sweeping methodically through the night. Beyond their compound lay the main camp with its prisoner blocks, and beyond that another fence system and the outer perimeter. 4 barriers to freedom, guards who shot without warning, German shepherds trained to tear flesh. The entire apparatus of SS terror refined over years of practice. James calculated the odds and found them far worse than Stalag Luft III. The thought steadied rather than discouraged him. If escape was nearly impossible, then attempting it was the ultimate defiance. The Gestapo had murdered 50 men to prove escape was futile. Succeeding would prove them liars. He turned from the window and found Jack Churchill watching him with the same cold calculation. Churchill had been thinking along identical lines. The two men exchanged a look that required no words. They had survived the Great Escape attempt, recapture, and the initial SS interrogations that might have ended in their own executions. Survival alone was no longer sufficient. Churchill nodded once, sharp and definite. James felt the commitment lock into place. They would plan, attempt, and succeed or die. There was no middle ground. Johnny Dodge, a man in his 50s meant for retirement, not hell's antechamber, stepped closer. "The other RAF officers here are with us," he whispered. "Whatever it takes." The vow spread through the group like a current, binding them in conspiracy. Sidney Dowes, young and burning with quiet fury, was already studying the guard patterns through the window. Peter Churchill, no relation to Jack, but equally determined, was mentally cataloguing their resources. 5 men. 5 targets for execution if they failed. 5 potential escapers if they succeeded. James forced himself to think tactically. They were in better physical condition than most camp prisoners. As part of SS propaganda, the Sonderlager received slightly better rations, so they had not yet suffered the skeletal deterioration that made escape physically impossible for many. Their strength, however, was relative and diminished from months of captivity. They were also under closer observation because of their history. The SS knew these men were dangerous. Every movement was watched. The guards were not the professional Luftwaffe of Stalag Luft III. These were SS ideologues, men selected for cruelty who would shoot first and investigate later. This made reconnaissance exponentially more dangerous. But it also meant the guards expected broken men, not active resistors. The psychological advantage of being underestimated was their first weapon. Over the following days, James began to observe rather than simply endure. The shift in perspective was total. Roll call became an opportunity to study guard shift changes. The morning march became a chance to map blind spots in the watchtowers. The rhythm of camp routine transformed from oppressive monotony into an exploitable pattern. He noticed the guard change at the main gate happened at precisely 1400 hours. For roughly 90 seconds during the handoff, attention was divided. 90 seconds. Sidney Dowes discovered the guard dogs were kennelled during the midday heat on summer afternoons, leaving the no-man's land patrolled only by human eyes for a narrow window. Another fragment of intelligence was logged and stored. Jack Churchill identified a pattern in the watchtower rotations. The southeastern tower was manned by an older guard who spent more time sitting, especially during evening shifts. His searchlight sweeps became perfunctory and mechanical after the first hour. The observation was hopeful and damning. The tower was a potential weak point, but exploiting it meant moving in darkness across open ground under lights. The margin for error was seconds. Johnny Dodge, using his military experience, noticed the SS administrative officers used a separate gate that opened directly onto a service road. It had less traffic, fewer guards, and critically, the substantial lock faced inward, designed to prevent entry, not exit. The hinges were accessible from their side. His glance at James conveyed the information. Another piece of the puzzle, the observations accumulated. The perimeter fence had a section near the northeastern corner where undergrowth grew taller, providing marginal visual cover. The evening food truck arrived at 1700 hours with mechanical regularity, creating noise and distraction. A maintenance shed within their compound contained tools locked in a wooden cabinet, less secure than the fence it sat beside. Each piece of information was individually trivial. Collectively, they formed the foundation of possibility. James began to see how the pieces might fit. Not a complete plan, but the outline of one. A route, a timing, a method. The shape of impossible becoming merely improbable. Observation alone changed nothing. They needed materials, which required risk. Peter Churchill volunteered for the first theft. During a supervised work detail, he pocketed a 6-inch metal file from a desk. The guard never noticed. Back in the barracks, Churchill handed the file to James. It was inadequate for cutting fence wire, but it could sharpen other objects and create tools from scrap. It was a beginning. Sidney Dowes followed 2 days later, acquiring 4 meters of frayed but functional cord from the supply shed by unwinding it from a tarp and concealing it under his jacket. It was useful for climbing, binding, a dozen potential applications. Each theft was a calculated gamble. Discovery meant interrogation, torture, and execution. But remaining passive guaranteed the same end on a slower timeline. James found himself thinking differently about everything. A loose floorboard was potential shim material. A rusted nail, if ground sharp, was a cutting implement. Wooden bed slats could be climbing aids. Even their thin uniforms became resources. Fabric could be torn into strips for binding or creating makeshift gloves for handling wire. Every object existed in dual states, its intended function and its escape utility. The transformation in thinking felt almost spiritual. They were no longer victims accepting their fate. They were operators planning resistance. The distinction mattered more than the resources they gathered. It meant they had stopped dying slowly and started fighting back. Johnny Dodge made contact with a Polish prisoner from the camp carpentry shop. The conversation was conducted in coded fragments over several days. The Pole knew the camp layout beyond their compound, the outer perimeter fences, and the best forest concealment. He knew the distance to neutral Sweden and about partisan networks. The information was priceless and freely given. The prisoner asked nothing in return except that they kill some Germans if the opportunity arose, a request delivered with a smile containing oceans of hatred. James promised to make the attempt count. That evening, the Pole passed them a hand-drawn map of the outer camp, smuggled inside a hollowed bread loaf. They studied the crude but accurate map until it was memorized, then burned it. The plan was emerging. They could not tunnel. Sachsenhausen was designed with seismographs, microphones, and soil probes to prevent it. Tunnel attempts had a 0% success rate. They could not disguise themselves as guards. SS uniforms were impossible to replicate. They could not walk out. Documentation was stringent, and guards knew every face. That left only a direct assault on the fence system, cutting through during darkness, moving fast, accepting a catastrophic risk of detection. It was the worst option, except for all the others. They would be exposed, vulnerable, racing against searchlights and bullets. But James had watched Roger Bushell organize an escape, knowing most would be recaptured. Big X had accepted the odds because doing nothing was unacceptable. James now understood that calculus completely. He gathered the group in the barracks' thickest shadows. The commitment was made, observations complete, resources assembled. "We go at night," Jack Churchill said, his voice steady. "Cut through both fences before the tower guards complete a sweep cycle, 90 seconds maximum." Sidney Dowes added, "We'll need a night with low moon and cloud cover, minimal visibility." Johnny Dodge calculated, "Mid-August gives us the longest nights." Peter Churchill looked at each man. "We're probably going to die attempting this." Everyone nodded, a realistic acknowledgement of the odds. The chance of 5 men cutting through Sachsenhausen's defences and escaping Germany was microscopic, but the odds of surviving until war's end in SS captivity were equally grim. At least escape offered agency. At least it honoured the 50. James felt the weight of their choice. This was not Stalag Luft III, where failure meant solitary confinement. This was Sachsenhausen, where failure meant torture and execution. The SS would make examples of them. Every man in the circle knew and accepted it. The alternative was to wait passively for a fate the SS determined, an option that had died with Roger Bushell. James thought of Big X's final moments, kneeling on a roadside as a Gestapo officer drew his pistol. Bushell had died refusing to accept captivity. James would honour that by refusing the same. If he died escaping, at least he would die on his own terms. He met each man's eyes and saw identical determination. They were committed. The planning began in earnest. They had 6 weeks to prepare, refine the plan, gather materials, and wait for the right weather. 6 weeks to feign submission while preparing to resist. The psychological strain would be immense. Discovery at any point meant death, but James felt something he had not experienced since before his recapture: purpose. The Gestapo had murdered 50 men to crush the spirit of Allied airmen. Instead, they had created something more dangerous than despair. They had created men with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Flight Lieutenant Bertram James looked at his fellow conspirators and knew they would attempt the impossible. Sachsenhausen's defences were formidable, the odds were terrible, and death was likely. But they would escape from this concentration camp, or they would die trying. Either outcome was preferable to submission. The plan was forming. The commitment was absolute. The only question remaining was execution. Chapter 4. August 1944, Sachsenhausen. The escape plan for Flight Lieutenant Bertram James's team centered on the most disgusting overlooked place in their compound, the earth closet latrine. Under the command of Major Johnny Dodge, the 5-man team began their tunnel with tools made from scraps of metal and wood scavenged from their bunks. While 2 men worked in the filth and darkness below, others kept watch, creating distractions and singing loudly to cover the sounds of digging through the sandy, treacherous soil. They used Red Cross issue towels sewn together to haul the excavated sand back, which was then painstakingly hidden in the barracks roof space. It was a race against time, exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of discovery by the SS patrols. Fueled by the memory of their murdered friends from Stalag Luft III, this tunnel was a monument of defiance being built directly under the noses of their executioners. The team assembled through whispered conversations and calculated risks. Major Johnny Dodge, an American-born British commando the Gestapo considered highly dangerous, made the first move. 49 years old and a veteran of 2 previous escape attempts, he approached James during evening roll call, standing shoulder to shoulder in formation. 3 words: the latrine, tonight. James nodded once. They had flown together at Stalag Luft III. Trust was the only currency that mattered. Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowse came next. A navigator with a precise mind, he was steady under pressure. He had survived the Great Escape massacre by pure chance, pulled from the execution list at the last moment. The memory made him methodical, not fearful. When Dodge outlined the plan during a work detail in the potato fields, Dowse's response was immediate: "I'll dig." Death held no terror for a man who had already heard the rifles being loaded. Lieutenant James Churchill Waller, a Royal Navy submarine officer, joined on the 3rd day. He was comfortable in confined spaces and understood structural integrity, able to read soil like others read books. When he examined the latrine floor during an authorized visit, he saw what the SS missed. The ground beneath sloped slightly toward the perimeter fence, a natural drainage that would keep the tunnel drier than most. He squeezed Dodge's shoulder once. The commitment was made. The fifth man was Jack Churchill, no relation to Winston, but every bit as stubborn. A commando officer captured in Yugoslavia, he had been transferred to Sachsenhausen because the Gestapo believed the conditions would break his spirit. They were wrong. He brought German language skills and an uncanny ability to read guard behavior. He would spend hours watching the SS patrols, memorizing their patterns and identifying the lazy ones. It was information that could mean the difference between escape and execution. The method was brutal in its simplicity. Tunnel 60 feet from the latrine cesspit through sandy soil to emerge beyond the wire in the cover of nearby woods. The technical challenge was enormous. The latrine sat 15 meters from the inner fence, but guard towers covered that ground with searchlights every 90 seconds. They would need to excavate beyond the outer fence, through the cleared killing zone, to reach the tree line. 60 feet with no proper tools or timber supports, through soil that could collapse and suffocate them at any moment. They would work at night when the stench might cover their sounds, and exit during the brief window when guard shifts changed at 0200 hours. This offered a mere 15 minutes of reduced vigilance for 5 men to emerge, cross open ground, and disappear. The first night, James descended into hell. The cesspit was 4 feet deep, filled with the accumulated waste of 200 prisoners. The smell didn't just assault the nose, it invaded the throat and lungs. Breathing became a conscious act of willpower. Waller went down with him, carrying a sharpened bedspring twisted into a crude trowel. They worked by touch in absolute darkness, scraping at the foundation until they found where cement met earth. It took 2 hours of silent agony before they broke through. James's hands bled from the rough concrete, and Waller vomited twice, silently, into the filth around them. Above, Dowes and Churchill sang off-key renditions of popular songs, masking the scraping sounds below. The sand came away in handfuls, then larger chunks. They filled a makeshift bag sewn from Red Cross towels, tugged twice on the rope, and felt it being hauled upward. An empty bag descended. They filled it again. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, fighting the instinct to rush and make noise. The tunnel entrance was 2 feet square, just wide enough for a man to squeeze through on his belly. They worked in 30-minute shifts. Any longer, and the mind started to fracture in the absolute darkness and thin air, with the persistent certainty of being buried alive. Disposing of the sand created its own nightmare. 60 feet of tunnel meant roughly 8 cubic meters of soil. In a compound under constant surveillance, hiding that much was nearly impossible. Churchill discovered the barracks roof had a hollow cavity for ventilation. Each night after digging, 2 men would climb into the rafters using a human pyramid and distribute the sand along the cavity, spreading it thin so the ceiling wouldn't sag. The process took hours, with exhausted men hauling filthy bags up through a narrow access point, working in near-total silence as SS patrols walked past outside. The close call came on September the 3rd. James was 10 feet into the tunnel, scraping at the face with his bare hands after the metal tools had worn smooth. His hands were raw meat, nails torn away. Focused on his work, he heard the sound that stopped his heart. German voices directly above. SS guards had entered the latrine. He froze. The guards were talking mere feet above his head. He was lying in a tunnel beneath a concentration camp latrine, covered in filth, and 2 SS guards stood exactly where the tunnel penetrated the cesspit floor. If they noticed the displaced boards, he would die here, shot or dragged out and executed as an example. Time stretched. His lungs screamed for air as he held his breath as if it could make him invisible. His heart hammered so loudly he was certain they'd hear it through the earth. Then one of the guards used the latrine, the sound of urine splashing into the cesspool, inches from where James lay hidden. The casual violation, the absolute indifference. Then they left, boots on wood, voices fading. James sucked in air, tasting filth and terror. He lay shaking for 5 minutes before he could move. When he finally crawled back to the entrance, Waller saw his face in the dim light and simply nodded. No words were needed. They had come within seconds of discovery. Tomorrow they would go back down. Over 3 weeks, the tunnel advanced 18 inches per night, progress measured in agony. The sandy soil collapsed constantly, requiring them to re-dig sections multiple times. With no timber for supports, the tunnel existed in a state of permanent near collapse. Churchill developed a system of listening posts, timing patrols precisely to give the diggers maximum warning. Dowes calculated the tunnel's trajectory nightly, using shadows to ensure they weren't veering off course. Dodge coordinated everything. The maestro of desperate men, the physical toll mounted. The 5 men, already weakened by camp rations, were expending thousands of calories they didn't have. Their bodies consumed themselves to continue. James dropped 12 pounds. His hands became infected from the sewage and sand. Waller developed a persistent cough from the foul air, but they couldn't stop. Every foot of tunnel was a victory over the SS, over the memory of 50 friends murdered at Stalag Luft III. September the 23rd brought the decision. The tunnel was at 58 feet, close enough to the tree line. Dodge called a meeting in the shadows between bunks. "Tomorrow night," he said, his voice low. "The ground's hardening. We won't get much further without supports we don't have. Tomorrow, or we risk losing it all to collapse." Churchill reported the guard schedules. Shift change at 0200. New guards take 8 minutes to reach full positions. Old guards leave 4 minutes early. It's a 12-minute window. He didn't need to add that it wasn't enough time for 5 men. They all knew some of them wouldn't make it. Final preparations were minimal. They had nothing. No civilian clothes, no forged papers, no food beyond crusts, saved from rations. Their plan was suicidal. Exit the tunnel, run for the woods, and survive while moving north towards the Baltic coast to find a boat and cross to Sweden. September 24th crept by. Roll call, work detail, watery soup. Each hour brought them closer to freedom or death. James couldn't eat his evening ration. His stomach clenched with anticipation. In the barracks, the team prepared in silence. Dowes checked their boots, tightening laces. Churchill watched the guard patterns one last time. Waller cleaned sand from beneath his fingernails, a futile gesture. Dodge sat on his bunk, eyes closed, preparing his mind. At 2200 hours, the barracks settled into uneasy sleep. The 5 men lay awake, fully dressed. At 0130, Dodge rose. 4 shadows followed him to the latrine. The September night was moonless and cold, biting through their thin uniforms. Inside, they worked with practiced efficiency. Boards were removed from the cesspit floor. James descended first, dropping into the filth and then crawling into the tunnel. The smell no longer registered. Fear had burned away everything but the mission. Waller followed, then Dowes, then Churchill. Dodge would come last, pulling the boards into place to delay discovery. The tunnel stretched into absolute darkness. James crawled forward, sand scraping his elbows, the ceiling inches from his head. He knew that 60 feet of German soil pressed down above him, that guards with machine guns patrolled somewhere overhead. He was crawling toward freedom or his grave. His hands found the tunnel face where they had stopped. 2 feet of earth remained. He positioned the sharpened bed spring and began scraping. Each scrape brought soil cascading down. The tunnel compressed around his shoulders. He couldn't raise his head, only push forward. His breathing came in short gasps, the air thick with earth. Behind him he felt Waller's hand on his boot, a steadying pressure. "Keep moving," the bed spring punctured through. Fresh, cold night air flooded the tunnel, tasting like life itself. James widened the hole, sand pouring around him. He could see real grass, lit by the distant glow of guard tower searchlights, 60 feet from latrine to freedom. They had done it. James pulled himself through the exit, emerging into the night air outside Sachsenhausen's wire. The tree line beckoned 50 meters distant. Behind him, Waller's head appeared, then Dow's, then Churchill. 4 men crouched in darkness, hearts pounding. Dodge emerged last, pulling himself free just as a searchlight began its sweep toward them. They had seconds to flatten themselves against the ground. The light passed overhead, sweeping the empty space where they had been crouching. Darkness returned. Dodge's hand signal, run, now. They ran. The cold September air burns James's lungs as he runs through darkness. His boots sink into wet German soil, each step pulling at muscles weakened by months of starvation rations. The perimeter fence of Sachsenhausen lies somewhere behind him, invisible, but the distance offers no comfort. He moves north by instinct and the faint glow of stars through scattered clouds, pushing through a pine forest that scratches his face and catches his prison-worn clothing. Branches snap under his feet despite his attempts at silence. Every sound feels like a gunshot in the quiet countryside. His heart hammers his ribs, adrenaline the only fuel for legs that should have collapsed miles ago. The tunnel exit left him caked in latrine filth, but there is no time for dignity or disgust. Freedom smells like pine needles and damp earth and tastes of metallic fear. He stumbles over a root, catches himself on a tree trunk and forces himself upright. Keep moving. The Baltic coast is 40 or 50 miles ahead through enemy territory, crawling with Wehrmacht patrols, Hitler youth units, and civilian informers who would trade him for extra rations. James has no map, no compass, no food, only a thin civilian jacket, foreign trousers and boots that would leave incriminating tracks. The forest thins and he slows, dropping to a crouch. Through the trees, moonlight reflects off a ploughed field stretching into darkness. Crossing means exposure, but north is the only direction that matters. He waits in the tree line, listening for engines or voices. Nothing, only the wind and his own ragged breathing. Decision made. James breaks from cover, running low across the field, his boots churning soft earth. Halfway across, his foot catches a furrow and he sprawls forward, the impact driving the air from his lungs. He lies gasping, tasting dirt, waiting for gunfire. Silence. He pushes himself up, ignoring scraped palms, and completes the crossing to another tree line. He collapses against an oak, chest heaving, allowing himself 30 seconds of rest. The physical reality of his escape crashes over him as the initial adrenaline fades. His body isn't the one that trained as a pilot in 1940. 4 years of captivity, the last months in Sachsenhausen's special compound, stripped away muscle and resilience. His legs shake with exhaustion after less than 2 miles, stomach cramps from emptiness. The jacket does nothing against the September cold, seeping through the fabric. He desperately needs water. Dawn is perhaps 4 hours away, and daylight means discovery. The calculation is brutal. Reach the coast before his strength gives out, or die trying. Returning to Sachsenhausen means execution, not imprisonment. The SS doesn't forgive breaches of its security. James forces himself upright and continues north. The terrain becomes rolling farmland with scattered buildings. He circles wide around a darkened farmhouse, dogs barking at his scent on the wind. The sound sends ice through his veins. Dogs. If they deploy dogs, the chase will last minutes, not hours. He increases his pace, despite screaming muscles, half running through a ditch that provides cover but fills his boots with freezing water. 1 foot in front of the other. Breathe, move, survive. A pale gravel road materializes ahead. He drops prone at the tree line and watches. No traffic, but roads mean patrols. Crossing requires complete exposure. He waits, counting heartbeats, then sprints across. His boot catches the far edge, and he windmills his arms to balance, nearly falling again. Made it. The eastern sky shows the faintest hint of pre-dawn grey. Time is running out. James pushes into a denser forest and allows himself to slow, leaning against a tree, closing his eyes for a moment. Mistake. When they open, the sky has lightened perceptibly, and his legs have begun to stiffen. He has perhaps an hour before full dawn makes travel suicidal. The temperature has dropped and he shivers uncontrollably, his body too depleted to generate warmth. Ahead, he hears water and staggers toward it. The stream runs cold and clear. James drops to his knees and drinks deeply, the cold aching in his throat, but his body desperate for it. He splashes his face and washes the filth from his hands. The stream runs north, and he follows it, using the water to mask his scent. His boots are soaked, but tactical thinking overrides comfort. Miles to the south, Sachsenhausen stands in its final hour of darkness before morning roll call. In the special compound, prisoners pretend to sleep, knowing what will come when the SS discovers 5 empty bunks. At 0530 hours, guards enter Block A barracks, whistles blow, prisoners stumble from bunks, forming ragged lines. An SS officer moves down each row, ticking names on his roster. First row complete, second row 3 men short, third row 2 men missing. He stops, recounts, 5 absent. The officer's face drains of colour. He shouts for the Blockführer, who comes running. They check every bunk, every corner, the latrine. 5 prisoners gone. Impossible. This is Sachsenhausen, not some ordinary Stalag. This compound holds enemies of the Reich too dangerous for standard camps. Security is absolute. The Blockführer races to the commandant's office, hammering on the door. SS Sturmbannführer Kindl emerges, still fastening his tunic, his irritation transforming into fury at the report. 5 prisoners missing from Block A. 5. He grabs his cap and strides toward the compound, his boots striking gravel like gunshots. Every guard in the vicinity snaps to attention. Kindl enters the barracks and surveys the empty bunks, his hands shaking with rage. The Gestapo placed these prisoners in his personal care. Berlin watches this camp. 5 escapes represent not just a security failure, but a potential death sentence for everyone responsible. Kindl turns to the Blockführer, his eyes like ice. Find how they escaped, now. Guards pour through the compound, searching every building and crawl space. Other prisoners are frozen in formation outside, forbidden to move in the near-freezing temperature. The search team reaches the latrine building, where a guard notices the wooden boards over the waste pit look disturbed. They tear away the boards and discover the tunnel entrance, a hole burrowed through foul muck and then out toward the perimeter fence. The construction shows skill and desperate determination. The guard examining it vomits. They follow the tunnel's trajectory to the exit point beyond the wire concealed in a drainage ditch. The escape route is mapped within 20 minutes. Kindl stares at the tunnel entrance as though its existence is a personal betrayal. 5 prisoners crawled through this filth, over 100 feet under his impregnable camp. When he speaks, his voice is quiet, more dangerous than shouting. Deploy every available unit. Contact Gestapo headquarters in Oranienburg. Alert all Wehrmacht posts within 50 kilometers. Issue descriptions of the escapees. He pauses, adding the critical order. Recapture is preferred, but shoot to kill if they resist. No chances. The Nazi security apparatus grinds into motion with terrifying efficiency. Within an hour, Gestapo cars race along roads surrounding Sachsenhausen. Wehrmacht patrols receive photographs. Local police are ordered to interrogate any suspicious persons. The district Gestapo chief, SS Sturmbannführer Müller, personally commands the manhunt from Oranienburg. He spreads maps across a table, calculating escape vectors. 5 prisoners splitting up means 5 directions, but they all need food, clothing, and distance. The most logical objective is the Baltic coast, 40 miles north, where they might steal a boat. Müller orders concentrated patrols along all northern routes and roadblocks on major highways. He requisitions tracking dogs from the Wehrmacht K9 unit at Bernau. By 0800 hours, 3 German shepherds are at Sachsenhausen, noses pressed to the tunnel exit. They hit the trail immediately, straining at their leashes as they pull north into the forest. James knows none of this. He only knows dawn has broken grey and cold. He has travelled perhaps 6 miles, and his body is approaching collapse. The stream ended, and he has navigated by dead reckoning since. Twice he has thrown himself into ditches to avoid farm workers. A passing truck was close enough that he heard the driver singing. Each incident sends adrenaline spiking, but it no longer masks his exhaustion. His vision blurs. His legs move mechanically, no longer under conscious control. Feet bleed inside his boots. The cold is a narcotic numbness that makes stopping seem reasonable. He forces himself onward. A small woods appears 200 meters across a harvested field. Cover. He can hide there, rest, and continue after dark. The distance looks impossible, but he starts across. 100 meters. 50. Behind him, to the south but closing, a dog barks. The sound floats across the morning air, distant but unmistakable. Then another and a third, tracking dogs. James's head snaps around, but he sees nothing. The barking is episodic, purposeful. They are on his scent. They are coming. He breaks into a stumbling run, abandoning caution. 25 meters, 10. He crashes into the woods and plunges deeper, underbrush tearing at his clothes and skin. A fallen log blocks his path, and he trips, sprawling into dead leaves. He lies there, chest heaving, listening. The barking is closer, much closer. No time. James drags himself behind the log and lies flat, pulling leaves and dead branches over his body with shaking hands. It's inadequate camouflage, but all he can do. He presses his face into the damp, rotting earth and goes absolutely still. His heart pounds so violently he fears it will shake the leaves. His breathing comes in ragged gasps he cannot control. The dogs are maybe half a kilometer away, their barking excited and continuous. Through the leaves, James hears them enter the field he just crossed, paws hitting stubble at a full run, handlers shouting commands in German, 3 dogs, maybe 4. His muscles lock, his body frozen, except for the involuntary tremors of exhaustion and cold. The barking reaches the tree line, enters the woods. The dogs cast about, noses to the ground. One handler calls to another, his tone urgent. A dog yelps, excited, then falls silent. They have lost the scent where he climbed over the log. Seconds stretch into eternity. James does not breathe. He does not move. He becomes part of the forest floor. A dog snuffles through leaves 10 meters to his left. It circles, approaches, 5 meters, 3. The animal's harsh panting is audible now. Paws crunch leaves an arm's length from James's head. Chapter 6. The old Home Guard corporal's hand shakes as he points his rifle at James. The man is 60 if he's a day, his uniform hanging loose on a thin frame, but the rifle is steady enough, and James is too weak to run. Starvation has hollowed him out from the inside, every bone visible. For 3 days, each step has been a negotiation with collapse. He had been so close. The Baltic was there, just beyond the next ridge. Sweden and freedom across those cold waters. Now this. In the village square, rough hands search him, pulling at his ragged civilian coat to find the hidden RAF tunic beneath. The sight of it changes everything. The old men step back, one crossing himself. They know what this means. An escaped RAF officer this far from any camp. The Gestapo will want him, will question how he got here, and will punish anyone who might have helped. The Home Guard sergeant makes a telephone call from the village post office. James stands in the square, swaying, watching his last chance at freedom dissolve into autumn mist. The Gestapo arrive in less than 2 hours, a black Mercedes roaring into the village. 2 officers step out, young, with hard faces. Their immaculate uniforms make James acutely aware of his own filth. They look at him the way scientists examine specimens. No anger, just cold assessment. One walks a slow circle around him, taking in the skeletal frame, matted beard, and the civilian clothes over RAF blue. He stops in front of James and speaks in perfect English. "You are a long way from Stalag Luft III, Flight Lieutenant." James says nothing. The Gestapo officer smiles, a look of recognition as a puzzle assembles itself. We received notice of your escape from Sachsenhausen. You and the other great escape survivors. Tell me, how many of your companions are still alive? The question lands like a physical blow. James knows what happened to the 50. He knows these men likely pulled triggers themselves. He meets the officer's eyes and says nothing. They handcuff him. The iron biting into wrists raw from weeks of deprivation. He's loaded into the back seat of the Mercedes. His body sinks into the soft, warm leather, the most comfortable thing he has felt in months. The absurd luxury of being driven to his probable execution nearly makes him laugh. The return journey takes 3 days. Instead of driving straight to Sachsenhausen, they stop at Gestapo headquarters in Kiel and its basement interrogation rooms. James knows the routine and what they want. Camp layouts, escape methods, names. He gives them nothing. They do not beat him. His physical state makes torture unnecessary. Starvation has already done their work. They simply deny him food and water, letting his own body become the instrument of pain. After 24 hours, his body breaks. He faints during questioning and wakes on a concrete floor. A detached doctor examines him, checks his pulse, and pronounces him stable enough to continue. They give him water and thin broth, just enough to keep him conscious. The questioning resumes. This Gestapo officer is different, older, with a scarred face and a voice like gravel. He sits across a wooden table and lights a cigarette, offering one to James. James takes it, his hands shaking so badly he can barely hold it steady. The officer lights it for him. The first tobacco in a month makes his head spin. You escaped Sachsenhausen, the officer says, a statement of fact. You survived alone for 32 days behind German lines. You walked over 200 miles. You did this after spending months in a punishment camp designed to break RAF escapers. He taps ash into a metal tray. Impressive, futile but impressive. James smokes in silence. We will return you to Sachsenhausen. You understand this, yes? The officer leans forward. But I'm curious. What did you think would happen when you reached Sweden? Did you imagine they would welcome you, give you a medal, send you home? James meets his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. I would have been free. The officer studies him, something shifting in his expression. Not sympathy, but perhaps a recognition of will. You will die in that camp, Flight Lieutenant. If not from punishment, then from the conditions. The war is lost, Germany is dying, but Sachsenhausen will kill you before liberation comes. He crushes out his cigarette. Your freedom walk has accomplished nothing except guaranteeing your death. James finishes his cigarette, hands still shaking. He thinks of the past month. The forests, the foreign workers who risked sharing bread, the stars overhead as he walked north, getting closer. I was free, he says. For 32 days I was free. That's more than nothing. The officer's face hardens, the moment of recognition passing. He calls for guards. James is taken to his cell, given more broth, and allowed to sleep on a wooden bench. Small mercies before the return to hell. They transfer him on the 3rd day. The same 2 young officers drive him through November rain. Through the glass, James watches a dying Germany. Bombed cities, refugees on the roads, the shrinking Reich collapsing inward. He feels separate, already a ghost. Sachsenhausen's gates appear through the rain. The camp has grown, more watchtowers, more wire. At the main gate, the Gestapo officers hand over paperwork to the SS. James can't hear the discussion, but he sees the SS commander's face change as he reads, then look at James and nod slowly. They pull him from the car and drag him through the gates. Word spreads instantly through the compound. The RAF officer who escaped is back. In the other prisoner's eyes, he sees not pity, but something like pride or envy. He is taken directly to the commandant's office. A different man from before, harder, with a reputation for not tolerating disobedience. The commandant sits, not acknowledging James for a full minute as he reads the Gestapo report. Finally, he looks up. You embarrassed the Reich, he says in German. You made fools of German security. You survived where you should have died. He closes the folder. This cannot stand. James knows what is coming. The isolation cell, starvation, probably execution. The 50 were murdered for less. He has no illusions, but he stands as straight as his wasted frame allows and meets the commandant's eyes, refusing to look away. "You will be placed in solitary confinement," the commandant continues. "No food for 3 days, then minimal rations. You will remain in isolation until further notice." He pauses. "The Gestapo wanted you shot. I convinced them you would serve as better example alive, a warning to others who think escape is possible." They take him to the isolation block, a concrete cell, 2 meters by 3, with no window and a bucket in the corner. When the door closes, he sinks to the floor in total darkness, feeling the cold seep up from the stone. The month of freedom burned through his body's reserves. Now the camp will finish what starvation started, but he does not regret it. For 32 days, he walked free under an open sky, saw stars without barbed wire, and breathed air not thick with camp smoke. He made decisions, chose his path, lived as a man instead of a number. In the darkness, he sees the journey behind his closed eyes. The forests, the Baltic he almost reached, the old home guards shaking hands, the fine line between freedom and this cell. On the second day, his body fails. Dysentery from the bucket water, then fever. He drifts, dreaming of walking north. The dreams are more real than the cell. He walks through shifting forests and crosses rivers that become oceans. In the dreams, he reaches Sweden and stands on free soil. He wakes to fever, still a prisoner, but something has changed. The dreams were memory. He did walk those forests. It was real. On the third day, they bring bread and water. He cannot eat. Swallowing is agony. The guard leaves it anyway. Lying on the concrete, he thinks of the other great escape survivors still in the camp. He wonders if his attempt inspired them or endangered them, if his freedom walk cost others their lives. But the answer doesn't matter now. He did what every captured airman is ordered to do. He made the attempt. He did his duty. The fact that he failed does not erase the trying. The isolation continues as days blur. Food comes, but often he cannot eat. His body consumes itself. He knows he is dying, that his freedom walk will end here in darkness and cold. But they did not break him, not the Gestapo, not the commandant, not Sachsenhausen itself. The attempt was a victory, partial, incomplete, but real. He drifts between waking and dreaming. The cell disappears, and he is walking again, north through forests, his body strong. He reaches the Baltic shore and begins to swim. The cold of the concrete floor wakes him, his body shivering uncontrollably, but in his mind he is still swimming, stroke after stroke towards the far shore, getting closer. One more stroke. Sachsenhausen has his body, but it does not have all of him. Some part remains free, forever walking those forests, forever swimming towards Sweden. They can kill his body, but they cannot imprison what already flew beyond their reach. His war is not over. Liberation will come, the camp will fall, and survivors will tell his story. The 32 days of freedom, the walk that almost succeeded, the RAF officer who refused to stop trying, who made it further than anyone believed possible, who faced the Gestapo with the quiet satisfaction of having beaten them, if only for a while. Liberation came on April the 20th, 1945. Bertram James had survived Sachsenhausen concentration camp's second tunnel, survived the freezing forest on the other side, survived recapture, and survived the bureaucratic miracle that returned him to Stalag Luft III instead of an execution yard. When American forces finally arrived at the camp, James was a human skeleton weighing 93 pounds. The medical officer who examined him noted the obvious signs of severe malnutrition, the deep frostbite scars on both feet, and the distinct psychological trauma consistent with what they were only beginning to understand about the survivors of the Nazi camp system. James politely but firmly refused hospitalization. His mind, however, was intact and urgent. he had intelligence to deliver. Within 48 hours of liberation, he was debriefing British intelligence officers, detailing Sachsenhausen's layout, guard rotations, and the location of specific documents he had managed to see in the commandant's office during his brief detention there. His memory, honed and sharpened by months of intelligence gathering as a prisoner of war, provided crucial, granular details that helped war crimes investigators grasp the administrative machinery of the vast concentration camp system. In June 1945, promoted to squadron leader, James received the orders that would define his immediate post-war years. He was to serve as a key witness at the upcoming trials. His precise first-hand account of the Gestapo's interrogation methods, the cold-blooded murder of the 50 great escapers, and the inhuman conditions at Sachsenhausen became a vital part of the official record at Nuremberg. In the courtroom, he calmly and without hesitation identified 3 Gestapo officers who had participated in the selection of which recaptured escapers would live and which would be executed. His voice, steady and factual, described how fellow prisoners he knew had simply disappeared after recapture. The judges listened intently. 2 of the officers he identified were convicted and subsequently hanged. The 3rd received a sentence of life imprisonment. James's critical contribution to the legal record was meticulously documented in trial file NMT 45, now archived at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. After Nuremberg, James faced a choice familiar to thousands of returning POWs: speak about the horrors of captivity or bury them in silence. He chose documentation, but the form was careful and controlled. In 1947, he wrote Moonless Night, a memoir that detailed his experiences with an almost clinical precision, avoiding overt emotionality. The book sold modestly in Britain, found a small, appreciative audience among military historians, and then quietly faded from public consciousness. By then, The Great Escape had already captured the popular imagination through Paul Brickhill's 1950 bestseller, which mentioned James only in passing. When Hollywood adapted the story in 1963 for its blockbuster film, James's name did not appear in the credits at all. The film famously ended with the tunnel's discovery and the subsequent murders. The Sachsenhausen chapter, The Second Tunnel, the successful escape from a concentration camp, all of it was compressed into a simple closing title card that read, "In all, 76 men escaped, only 3 made it to safety." James was one of those 3, but the audiences who made the film a legend never knew his name. The forgetting happened systematically, almost by design. James's vital intelligence debriefings remained classified secret until 1982. The specific details of what he had observed at Sachsenhausen, the camp's layout, the prisoner categories, the administrative procedures, were considered operationally sensitive during the early Cold War. After all, Sachsenhausen sat in East Germany, and Western intelligence wanted no public discussion of how much Allied officers had learned about the internal workings of a Soviet-controlled site. James understood and complied. He never publicly discussed the intelligence aspects of his captivity. When interviewers asked about his escape, he would simply redirect them to the published account in Moonless Night. The classified debriefings sat in Ministry of Defense archives, Box 847, Section G, accessible only to a handful of vetted researchers with security clearance. His own family knew he had escaped twice. They knew he had been in Sachsenhausen, but the details, the tunnel construction using stolen bedboards, the forged passes created by a fellow British prisoner who'd been a bank clerk, the harrowing 3-day forest evasion in the depths of February, those specifics James kept locked away. His daughter later recalled asking him once about the nightmares that woke him throughout the 1950s. He had simply smiled and changed the subject to her school examinations. The trauma was a private burden. The era's veterans didn't have the vocabulary for what would later be called PTSD. They called it adjusting and managed it with a stoic silence. Meanwhile, The Great Escape dominated the cultural narrative. Brickhill's book went through 16 printings. The film became an enduring classic. Escape stories from Stalag Luft III filled bookstores and television documentaries for decades, but those stories always ended at the tunnel's discovery. The grittier, more complex truth that some escapers had been recaptured and murdered, that survivors had been sent to concentration camps, and that from those camps men had heroically escaped again, simply didn't fit the triumphant Hollywood arc. James's story, arguably the most remarkable continuation of the Great Escape saga, merited only 3 paragraphs in military intelligence summaries and occasional mentions in academic texts about prisoner resistance. The broader public never knew, but his fellow POWs knew. The RAF Prisoners of War Association, meeting annually at RAF Hendon, kept the full record. The men who'd been at Stalag Luft III, who'd helped dig both tunnels, who'd watched James disappear after recapture and thought him dead, these men knew when he returned. They preserved his story in veteran newsletters and private correspondence, a sacred history held close. James attended the reunions quietly until his health began to fail in the late 1990s. The rediscovery began with declassification. In 1982, the 37-year rule released James's intelligence debriefings to the National Archives. A Cambridge historian named Dr. Sarah Helm, researching British intelligence activities during the war's final months, requested access to files related to Sachsenhausen survivors. Box 847 arrived at her desk. She was the first civilian to read James's detailed account of the concentration camp tunnel in nearly 4 decades. The specificity stunned her. Precise measurements of guard rotations, architectural sketches of cell block layouts, and names of SS officers that cross-referenced with documents later used at Nuremberg. This was not just another escape story. This was intelligence work of the highest order, conducted under conditions that should have made it utterly impossible. Helm contacted James in 1983. He was 72, retired, and living quietly in Devon. She asked if he would be willing to discuss the classified portions of his experience for a new historical record. He respectfully declined. Too many men had not made it, he explained. It did not feel right to claim attention for doing what he felt anyone would have done. Helm respected his wishes, but included his declassified debriefing documents in her 1985 book, The War Behind the Wire, which examined intelligence gathering by Allied POWs. The book reached a specialized audience of military historians and intelligence professionals. Slowly, James's name began appearing in footnotes and bibliographies. The second wave of rediscovery came from within the military itself. In 1994, the U.S. Air Force SERE, Survival, Evasion, Resistance and Escape School at Fairchild Air Force Base, undertook a comprehensive review of historical cases to update its training curricula. An instructor named Major Robert Chen, assigned to review British POW files from WWII, encountered James's case. He recognized something the earlier historians had missed. This was a perfect teaching case for Code of Conduct Article 3. Here was a man who embodied the very principle of ceaseless resistance. James hadn't just escaped once and stopped. He'd escaped, been recaptured, been sent to a concentration camp specifically designed to break the will of resistance prisoners, and had immediately begun planning another escape. The psychological resilience required to attempt a second tunnel after seeing 50 comrades be murdered for the first attempt. That was precisely the kind of grit SERE schools needed to teach. Chen wrote a detailed case study titled Serial Resistance, the B.A. James Case. He travelled to Britain in 1996 to interview James personally. By then, James was 85, and after 50 years, finally willing to discuss what he had so long held back. The interview, conducted over 3 days at James's home, was recorded and transcribed. Chen asked specific professional questions about decision-making under duress, about maintaining hope after catastrophic failure, and about the psychological mechanics of starting over after the Great Escape's disaster. James's answers were clinical and precise. He explained he had maintained his sanity in Sachsenhausen by treating tunnel construction as a complex engineering problem. He had compartmentalized his profound grief for his murdered friends by focusing on immediate, tangible survival tasks. He had sustained hope by making it an active choice, deciding each morning to resist for that day, never thinking beyond the next 24 hours. Chen's case study formally entered SERE curricula in 1997. Today, James's story lives on in specific military applications. At the Navy SERE School in Brunswick, Maine, instructors teaching resistance techniques during the captivity phase reference James's intelligence-gathering methods. Students learn his approach, observe guard patterns for 3 days before attempting to exploit them, memorize rather than record sensitive information, treat every single interaction as an intelligence opportunity. The lesson is concrete. James's observations at Sachsenhausen directly assisted war crimes prosecutors, proving that even in the darkest conditions, a prisoner can contribute to the larger war effort. His name appears in the training manual's case study section. James B.A., Flight Lieutenant, RAF, Sachsenhausen Intelligence Collection, 1944-1945. The Air Force's Code of Conduct training incorporates James's case when teaching Article 3. If I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. Instructors explain that resistance is not only about escape attempts. James's first act upon arriving at Sachsenhausen was to begin mentally mapping the camp layout. That was resistance. His documentation of SS officers' names and ranks, that was resistance. The actual tunnel construction came later, but the resistance was immediate and constant. The teaching point is that resistance is a mindset maintained through specific actions, not a single dramatic gesture. At the National Ex-Prisoner of War Museum in Andersonville, Georgia, James's case file occupies a place in the permanent collection. The exhibit includes a reproduction of his forged German pass from the Sachsenhausen escape, his original debriefing notes from 1945, and a photograph of him testifying at Nuremberg. The museum's educational program for military personnel includes a presentation on multiple escape attempts, with James's story as the centerpiece. The lesson emphasized is that first failure does not define capability. The British RAF Museum at Hendon maintains the most comprehensive James archive. His daughter donated his personal papers in 2010, 2 years after his death. The collection includes letters he wrote but never sent, sketches of both tunnels he helped construct, and his personal copy of Moonless Night with handwritten annotations he added in the 1990s. One annotation next to the passage describing his recapture after the Sachsenhausen escape reads simply, "Decided in that moment to try again, couldn't let them win." The museum's oral history collection includes Chen's 1996 interview, now digitized and available to researchers. James died on March 18, 2008, at age 96. The obituaries in British newspapers ran brief, a paragraph about the Great Escape, a mention of his Nuremberg testimony, and nothing about Sachsenhausen's second tunnel. But the RAF Benevolent Fund's memorial service at St. Clement Danes drew 140 attendees. SERE instructors who had taught his case studies, historians who had documented his story, and family members of other great escapers who understood what James had witnessed. The eulogy, delivered by a wing commander who had never met James but had taught his story to generations of SERE students, focused on a single detail. After liberation, James had requested permission to return to Germany to testify. He had volunteered to face the men who had murdered his friends. The choice wasn't required, other witnesses were available. But James insisted. The wing commander's final words were, He made resistance an active choice, repeated daily, until the day liberation made choice unnecessary. Then he chose again, to witness, to document, to ensure justice. That is the complete record. What the Hollywood film never captured, what the best-selling books elided, what took 50 years to properly document, was that resistance isn't one tunnel, one escape, one dramatic moment. James proved it was the decision made again and again, in Stalag Luft III after recapture, in Sachsenhausen when hope was a choice against all evidence, in that freezing forest when forward motion was entirely willpower. The doctrine taught now at SERE schools is simple. Captivity ends only when you accept it. James never accepted it. Not after 50 murders, not inside a concentration camp, not ever. The tunnel under Sachsenhausen collapsed when the camp was demolished in 1950, but the measurements James memorized helped Allied intelligence understand concentration camp construction. In 1961, when the East German government began building the Berlin Wall, Western analysts used those old Sachsenhausen files to help predict guard tower placement and underground detection systems. His memory of a tunnel built in hell informed Cold War intelligence for 16 years. The SERE instructors teaching his case don't emphasize heroism. They emphasize repetition. James escaped twice, was recaptured twice, and started over twice. Most prisoners break not from a single trauma, but from accumulated defeat. James's counter-strategy was to make the decision small and daily. Today's lesson to students is to pick one small act of resistance each day. James picked observing guard rotations, and that small act led to everything else. His name is carved on panel 23 of the Allied Air Force's memorial at Runnymede, alongside thousands who didn't return. But in the SERE school databases, in the declassified files, and in the case studies taught to those preparing for captivity, his story lives specifically, not the Hollywood version where the escape ends in murder. The real version, where resistance continued past the point where it made any logical sense. That is the story that needed preserving. That is the one they teach now.